The courtroom doors hadn't even fully opened before whispers started spreading like wildfire. Something explosive was about to unfold, and everyone could feel it. Cameras flashed relentlessly as Jasmine Washington stepped forward, her expression, tight eyes burning with a mix of anger and determination. Just feet away stood Kirk Frost, his face unreadable, but the tension in his clenched jaw told a completely different story. This wasn't just another celebrity disagreement. No, this was war. Sources close to the situation claim the harassment case Jasmine filed didn't come out of nowhere. Allegations had been quietly building for months, maybe even years, hidden behind forced smiles and staged appearances. But now, everything was spilling into the open, and fans are shocked at just how deep the drama runs. "You pushed me too far," Jasmine reportedly said in a heated exchange just days before filing the case. And if insiders are to be believed, that moment was only the beginning. As legal teams rushed in and family members took sides, emotions ran high behind the scenes. Friends turned into critics. Allies became enemies. And perhaps, most shocking, of all, people who once defended Kirk are now starting to question everything. What really happened between Jasmine and Kirk? Was this a long overdue stand? Or is there something more calculated beneath the surface? Because as the case officially begins, one thing is certain: the truth won't stay hidden much longer. And when it comes out, it could change everything. The tension didn't just stay outside the courthouse, it followed them inside like a storm ready to explode. Every step that Jasmine Washington took echoed louder than it should have, as if the entire building itself knew something serious was about to unfold. She didn't look back, not once, not at the cameras, not at the whispers, and definitely not at Kirk Frost, who stood just behind her. Surrounded by his legal team, trying to maintain a calm that no longer seemed believable. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. People shifted in their seats. Fans, bloggers, and even a few familiar faces from their shared past, all watching closely, waiting for the first spark. And it didn't take long. Jasmine's attorney stood up first, voice sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. "This is not just a misunderstanding, this is a pattern of behavior that has gone on for far too long." A murmur spread instantly. Fans are shocked, some leaning forward, others are ready, typing furiously on their phones because whatever was about to be revealed was clearly bigger than anyone expected. Kirk's lawyer quickly rose in response. "We strongly deny every allegation being presented here. This is an attempt to damage my client's reputation, nothing more." Jasmine finally looked up, her eyes locking onto Kirk for the first time since entering the room, and the moment felt electric. Emotions ran high, and even the judge had to call for order when the tension became too obvious to ignore. "You think this is about reputation?" Jasmine suddenly spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "This is about what you did." Gasps filled the room instantly. The family was left divided, some of Kirk's supporters shaking their heads while others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to believe anymore. Kirk leaned forward, whispering something to his lawyer before finally speaking out loud. "You're twisting everything, Jasmine, you know that." "No." She shot back almost immediately. "I stayed quiet for too long, that's what I know." And just like that, the courtroom wasn't just a legal space anymore. It had turned into a battlefield of past secrets, buried resentment, and accusations that refused to stay hidden any longer. Outside reactions were already spiraling out of control. Fans online began picking sides within minutes. Hashtags exploded across social media, some defending Jasmine, calling her brave, while others accused her of exaggerating the situation for attention. But what nobody could ignore was how serious the claims sounded. Back inside the courtroom, Jasmine's attorney began laying out a timeline, and with every detail, the room grew quieter and quieter. Repeated messages, unwanted appearances, escalating behavior that caused emotional distress. The attorney listed each point slowly, making sure every word landed. "This is not isolated, this is sustained harassment." Kirk shook his head, visibly frustrated. "This is insane. We had conversations, mutual conversations. Don't make it sound like something it wasn't mutual." Jasmine laughed bitterly, a sound that carried more pain than humor. "You call showing up where I was uninvited mutual? You call refusing to respect boundaries mutual?" The judge raised a hand, demanding calm, but the damage was already done. The words hung in the air, impossible to take back. In the back row, a familiar voice whispered, "This is getting bad." And honestly, that might have been the understatement of the year. As more details surfaced, the story began shifting from what people thought they knew to something far more complicated. Insiders who once believed this would be a simple case were now questioning everything because the narrative wasn't as clean as it seemed. Then came the first major twist. Jasmine's attorney presented what they described as evidence messages. screenshots and documented encounters, and while the content itself wasn't fully revealed yet, the implication alone was enough to send shockwaves through the room. Kirk's lawyer immediately objected, "We have not verified the authenticity of any of this." "You will have your chance," the judge responded firmly, but Kirk's expression changed in that moment, just slightly but enough for those paying attention to notice his confidence wavered for the first time, and Jasmine noticed too. "Yeah," she said quietly, almost to herself, "that's what I thought." Outside the courthouse, reporters were already preparing for what could easily become one of the most talked about cases of the year, because this wasn't just about two individuals anymore. This had turned into a public spectacle, where every detail, every reaction, every slip of emotion would be analyzed. Back inside the courtroom, Kirk leaned closer to his attorney again. This time more urgently, whispers exchanged rapidly, strategies shifting in real time, because whatever they had expected coming into this, it clearly wasn't this. Jasmine, meanwhile, sat back for a brief moment, taking a breath, but her hands still trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of finally saying everything out loud. "I tried to handle this privately," she said suddenly, her voice softer, but carrying across the room. "I really did." And that line hit differently because it suggested something deeper, something that hadn't even been fully explored. Yet if she tried to handle it privately, what exactly happened behind closed doors, and why did it reach a point where a public legal battle became the only option? Those questions lingered heavily as the judge called for a short recess, but instead of easing the tension, it only made things worse, because now everyone had time to talk, to speculate, to question, and the whispers grew louder. "What else is she hiding? Is there more evidence? Why didn't this come out sooner?" Even among Kirk's own circle, doubt began creeping in, and that might have been the most dangerous shift of all, because when your own side starts questioning things, the ground beneath you begins to crack. As Jasmine stood to leave the room briefly, she passed by Kirk just for a second, but neither of them spoke this time. The silence between them said more than any argument could. Cold, heavy, final, and as the doors closed behind them, one thing became painfully clear: this was only the beginning. The tension didn't just stay outside the courthouse, it followed them inside like a storm ready to explode. Every step that Jasmine Washington took echoed louder than it should have, as if the entire building itself knew something serious was about to unfold. She didn't look back, not once, not at the cameras, not at the whispers, and definitely not at Kirk Frost, who stood just behind her, surrounded by his legal team, trying to maintain a calm that no longer seemed believable. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. People shifted in their seats, fans, bloggers, and even a few familiar faces from their shared past, all watching closely, waiting for the first spark, and it didn't take long. Jasmine's attorney stood up first, voice sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. "This is not just a misunderstanding, this is a pattern of behavior that has gone on for far too long." A murmur spread instantly. Fans are shocked, some leaning forward, others already typing furiously on their phones, because whatever was about to be revealed was clearly bigger than anyone expected. Kirk's lawyer quickly rose in response. "We strongly deny every allegation being presented here. This is an attempt to damage my client's reputation. Nothing more." Jasmine finally looked up, her eyes locking onto Kirk for the first time since entering the room, and the moment felt electric. Emotions ran high, and even the judge had to call for order when the tension became too obvious to ignore. "You think this is about reputation?" Jasmine suddenly spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "This is about what you did." Gasps filled the room instantly. The family was left divided, some of Kirk's supporters shaking their heads while others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to believe anymore. Kirk leaned forward, whispering something to his lawyer before finally speaking out loud. "You're twisting everything, Jasmine, you know that." "No," she shot back almost immediately. "I stayed quiet for too long, that's what I know." And just like that, the courtroom wasn't just a legal space anymore, it had turned into a battlefield of past secrets, buried resentment, and accusations that refused to stay hidden any longer. Outside, reactions were already spiraling out of control. Fans online began picking sides within minutes. Hashtags exploded across social media, some defending Jasmine, calling her brave, while others accused her of exaggerating the situation for attention. But what nobody could ignore was how serious the claims sounded. Back inside the courtroom, Jasmine's attorney began laying out a timeline, and with every detail the room grew quieter and quieter. Repeated messages, unwanted appearances, escalating behavior that caused emotional distress. The attorney listed each point, slowly making sure every word landed. "This is not isolated, this is sustained harassment." Kirk shook his head, visibly frustrated. "This is insane. We had conversations, mutual conversations. Don't make it sound like something it wasn't mutual." Jasmine laughed bitterly, a sound That carried more pain than humor. You call showing up where I was uninvited, mutual. You call refusing to respect boundaries, mutual. The judge raised a hand demanding calm, but the damage was already done. The words hung in the air, impossible to take back. In the back row, a familiar voice whispered, "This is getting bad." And honestly, that might have been the understatement of the year. As more details surfaced, the story began shifting from what people thought they knew to something far more complicated. Insiders who once believed this would be a simple case were now questioning everything because the narrative wasn't as clean as it seemed. Then came the first major twist. Jasmine's attorney presented what they described as evidence messages, screenshots, and documented encounters, and while the content itself wasn't fully revealed yet, the implication alone was enough to send shockwaves through the room. Kirk's lawyer immediately objected. "We have not verified the authenticity of any of this. You will have your chance," the judge responded firmly, but Kirk's expression changed in that moment, just slightly but enough for those paying attention to notice his confidence wavered for the first time. And Jasmine noticed too. "Yeah," she said quietly, almost to herself, "that's what I thought." Outside the courthouse, reporters were already preparing for what could easily become one of the most talked about cases of the year, because this wasn't just about two individuals anymore. This had turned into a public spectacle where every detail, every reaction, every slip of emotion would be analyzed. Back inside the courtroom, Kirk leaned closer to his attorney again, this time more urgently. Whispers exchanged rapidly, strategies shifting in real time because whatever they had expected coming into this, it clearly wasn't. This Jasmine, meanwhile, sat back for a brief moment, taking a breath, but her hands still trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of finally saying everything out loud. "I tried to handle this privately," she said suddenly, her voice softer but carrying across the room. "I really did." And that line hit differently because it suggested something deeper, something that hadn't even been fully explored yet. If she tried to handle it privately, what exactly happened behind closed doors? And why did it reach a point where a public legal battle became the only option? Those questions lingered heavily as the judge called for a short recess, but instead of easing the tension, it only made things worse. Because now everyone had time to talk, to speculate, to question, and the whispers grew louder. What else is she hiding? Is there more evidence? Why didn't this come out sooner? Even among Kirk's own circle, doubt began creeping in. And that might have been the most dangerous shift of all, because when your own side starts questioning things, the ground beneath you begins to crack. As Jasmine stood to leave the room briefly, she passed by Kirk just for a second, but neither of them spoke this time. The silence between them said more than any argument could. Cold, heavy, final, and as the doors closed behind them, one thing became painfully clear: this was only the beginning. The hallway outside the courtroom erupted the moment Jasmine stepped out. Flashes of cameras lit up the space like lightning in a storm, reporters shouting questions over one another, trying to get anything, even a single word from her, but she kept walking, her face set, her silence louder than anything she could have said. Meanwhile, just a few steps behind, Kirk Frost emerged surrounded by his team, his expression tighter than before. The confidence he walked in with now slightly cracked, and people noticed. Fans are shocked because this wasn't the same Kirk who usually brushed off controversy with ease. This felt different, heavier. "Kirk, is there any truth to the claims?" one reporter yelled, pushing forward. He stopped just for a second, enough to turn his head slightly. "No," he said firmly, "and that's all I'm going to say right now." But even that short response didn't land the way he probably intended. The hesitation, the pause before speaking at all, added fuel to an already raging fire inside. A separate room, Jasmine finally sat down, her hands resting on the table, her lawyer beside her, flipping through documents quickly. "You did good in there," the lawyer said, trying to steady the moment. Jasmine exhaled slowly. "This isn't even half of it." And that sentence alone carried weight, the kind that hinted at even more revelations waiting to surface. Back in the main corridor, familiar faces began to gather, people who had once been neutral, now forced into uncomfortable positions, friends of both sides exchanging tense greetings or avoiding eye contact. Altogether, the family was left divided, and it was becoming more obvious by the minute. One voice broke through the tension: "I never thought it would get this far." It was someone close to Kirk, someone who had defended him publicly before. But now their tone lacked certainty, and others picked up on it immediately. "You still think he's innocent?" another person asked quietly. There was a pause, too long to ignore. "I don't know anymore." That uncertainty spread like wildfire, because doubt once planted doesn't stay contained, it grows, and right now it was growing fast. Meanwhile, inside another room, Kirk paced back and forth, his lawyer trying to keep up with his rapid thoughts. "This is being blown out of proportion," Kirk said, running a hand through his hair. "We had disagreements, yeah, but harassment That's a serious accusation, then we need to prove it's not true. The lawyer replied calmly, but you need to be careful, no emotional reactions, no outbursts, everything you say matters now more than ever. Kirk stopped pacing for a moment, staring at the floor. She's twisting things, but even as he said it, his voice lacked the full conviction it had earlier, and that subtle shift didn't go unnoticed by his own team. Back outside, social media was exploding, reactions pouring in by the second, clips from inside the courtroom, already circulating, fans analyzing every expression, every word, every pause. Emotions ran high as opinions clashed, some calling Jasmine brave for speaking out, while others accused her of trying to destroy Kirk's career. One viral post read, "This is bigger than we thought, something doesn't add up," and that sentiment echoed across platforms because the story was no longer simple, it had layers, and people were desperate to peel them back. As the court session resumed, the energy inside shifted. It was sharper, more intense, like everyone understood that the next phase could change everything. Jasmine returned to her seat, her posture straighter this time, more resolute. Kirk followed shortly after, his gaze briefly meeting hers before quickly looking away, and that moment, small but significant, didn't go unnoticed by anyone watching. The judge called for order, and Jasmine's attorney stood again, ready to continue. "Your Honor, we would like to proceed with further details regarding the timeline of events and introduce additional context that explains the escalation of this situation." Kirk's lawyer immediately responded, "We will be addressing inconsistencies in that timeline," and just like that, the tension snapped back into place. The attorney began carefully. What started as communication between two individuals gradually became something else. Repeated attempts to establish distance were ignored. Boundaries were crossed, and the situation escalated beyond what my client felt she could control. "That's not true," Kirk interrupted, unable to stay silent. The judge quickly stepped in. "Mr. Frost, you will wait your turn," but the interruption itself spoke volumes. Fans are shocked because Kirk, who had tried to remain composed, was now visibly reacting, and that reaction raised even more questions. Jasmine didn't look at him this time. She kept her eyes forward, but her jaw tightened slightly. "We have records of communication," her attorney continued, "including messages that show a clear request for space." Kirk's lawyer stood again. "We have not seen the full context of those messages. Selective presentation can create a misleading narrative. Then we welcome full review." Jasmine's attorney replied without hesitation, and that confidence hit hard because it suggested they were prepared for scrutiny, prepared for every detail to be examined. Then came another twist. A witness was mentioned, not yet called, but referenced, someone who had reportedly seen part of the interactions firsthand, and that revelation shifted the atmosphere instantly. "Who is the witness?" whispers spread across the room. Kirk's expression changed again, this time sharper, more alert. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, but it was loud enough for those nearby to hear. Jasmine finally turned her head slightly, her voice low but clear. "You know exactly who." And that line sent a ripple through the courtroom because it implied history, shared moments that hadn't yet been fully revealed. The judge called for a brief pause to review the next steps, but the impact was already there. The narrative was evolving, and neither side could fully control where it was heading anymore. Outside reactions intensified even further, analysts, bloggers, and fans all trying to piece together the puzzle, because now there was a new element. A witness, someone who could potentially confirm or contradict everything being said. "This changes everything," one commentator said in a live stream, and honestly, they weren't wrong. Back inside, Kirk sat down heavily, his lawyer leaning in close. "We need to know who they're talking about." "I have an idea," Kirk replied quietly, but his tone carried concern, and that concern was new. Jasmine, on the other side, appeared calmer, almost as if revealing that detail had given her some sense of control back. But control in situations like this is fragile, and it doesn't last long. Because just as things seemed to settle, another unexpected moment hit. Kirk's lawyer requested to present a counter-narrative hinting at a different version of events. One that painted their interactions as mutual, complicated, but not one-sided. Relationships can be messy, the lawyers stated. Misunderstandings happen, but labeling them as harassment without full context is dangerous. That argument struck a nerve, not just in the courtroom but among those watching, because it introduced out again, the kind that makes people question where the truth actually lies. Jasmine's reaction was immediate, a shake of her head, a quiet but firm no, and even though it was just one word, it carried conviction. The judge looked between both sides, clearly aware that this case was far from straightforward. "This court will consider all evidence presented," they said firmly, "and I remind both parties to maintain order." But order was becoming harder to hold onto with every passing moment. As the session continued, the emotional weight of everything began to show more clearly. Jasmine's composure occasionally slipping, just enough to reveal the strain Kirk's frustration building despite his efforts to contain it. The family was left divided, sitting on opposite sides of the room, some refusing to even look at each other anymore, and through it all, one question lingered heavier than anything else: what really happened behind closed doors? Because the pieces being revealed, while shocking, still felt incomplete, like there was something bigger, something even more explosive waiting just beneath the surface. And judging by the way both Jasmine and Kirk reacted every time certain details were mentioned, it was clear that whatever that missing piece was, it had the power to change everything again the next morning. Didn't bring any calm. If anything, it made everything worse. The moment the courthouse doors opened again, there was already a crowd waiting, larger than the day before, louder, more intense. The story had taken over every corner of public attention. And now people weren't just watching, they were invested inside the courtroom. The energy was completely different, no longer just tense, it was charged, like something big was about to break, and both sides knew it. Jasmine walked in first again. Her steps slower this time, but more deliberate, like she had made a decision overnight, something final, something that changed the way she carried herself. Kirk entered shortly after, and for the first time since this began, he avoided looking in her direction entirely, and that silence between them felt heavier than any argument they had before. The judge wasted no time. We will proceed with the witness referenced in the previous session, and just like that, every eye in the room shifted toward the door. The witness stepped in, and the reaction was immediate: whispers, gasps, confusion, because this wasn't just anyone, this was someone both Jasmine and Kirk knew very well, someone who had been present during some of their most private moments, someone who had stayed silent until now. Fans are shocked because no one expected this person to step forward. Kirk leaned forward instantly, his expression tightening. You've got to be kidding me. Jasmine didn't react outwardly, but her hands clenched slightly on the table, her composure holding but barely. The witness took the stand, and after being sworn in, the questioning began. Can you state your relationship to both parties? Jasmine's attorney asked. I've known them both for years, the witness replied. I've been around during conversations, arguments, situations that most people didn't see. That statement alone shifted the weight of the room. Because now this wasn't just he said, she said anymore, there was someone claiming direct insight. Did you observe any interactions that concerned you? The attorney continued. The witness paused just for a second, and that pause felt endless. Yes, a single word, but it hit like an explosion. Kirk shook his head immediately. This is unbelievable. The judge raised a hand sharply. Mr. Frost, control yourself. But control was slipping fast. Can you describe those interactions? The attorney pressed. The witness took a breath. There were times when Jasmine made it clear she needed space, and it didn't always seem respected. There were arguments that escalated quickly. There were moments where things felt uncomfortable even to be around. A ripple spread through the courtroom, emotions ran high, and the family was left divided, even more visibly now because hearing it from someone else made everything feel more real. Kirk's lawyer stood quickly. Objection. This is subjective interpretation. Overruled. For now, the judge responded. Continued. Jasmine's eyes lowered briefly, the weight of hearing someone else confirm parts of her experience clearly hitting her, but she didn't interrupt. She let the words stand. Did you ever communicate your concerns? The attorney asked. I tried, the witness said quietly. But it wasn't my place to get involved fully. That line lingered because it suggested something deeper, a hesitation that might have allowed things to continue longer than they should have. Now it was Kirk's lawyer's turn. They approached with a different tone, controlled, precise. You said you observed arguments. Would you agree that both parties were involved in those arguments? Yes, the witness admitted. So it wasn't one-sided conflict. Arguments rarely are, the witness replied. Carefully, that answer created another shift because it introduced balance. Again, complexity, again something that made the situation less clear-cut. Kirk's lawyer nodded slightly. And would you also agree that there were times when communication between them was mutual, even friendly? Another pause. Yes, the witness said, and just like that, the narrative twisted again. Fans are shocked, because every time one side seemed stronger, something new pulled it back into uncertainty. Kirk leaned back, slightly exhaling, as if that answer had given him a moment of relief, but it didn't last long because Jasmine's attorney stepped in. Again, friendly communication does not negate unwanted behavior, does it? The witness shook their head. No, it doesn't. And there it was again, the balance shifting back. This back and forth continued, each question peeling back another layer, but never revealing the full picture. The truth seemed to exist somewhere in between, tangled, complicated, and far more messy than anyone expected. Outside the courtroom, the reactions were even more intense. Live streams, debates, arguments, fans choosing sides, then switching sides as new details emerged. The entire situation had become unpredictable. Inside, Kirk's frustration was becoming harder to hide his fingers. Tapping rapidly against the table, his gaze fixed forward, but his thoughts clearly racing. Jasmine, on the other hand, seemed to draw strength from the witness's presence, even if not everything said was completely in her favor. It was no longer just her voice alone. Then came another moment that shifted everything again. A piece of evidence was introduced, something that hadn't been mentioned before, something that both sides seemed to react to at the exact same time. Kirk's head snapped up instantly. "Where did you get that?" Jasmine's expression changed to not shocked, but tense, like she knew this was coming but wasn't sure how it would land. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the judge calling for order repeatedly. "This document," Jasmine's attorney began, "provides additional context to the nature of the interactions in question." Kirk's lawyer stood immediately. "We need to review that before any conclusions are drawn." But the damage was already done, because whatever was in that document had clearly hit a nerve, and nerves don't lie. As the judge allowed a brief review period, both sides huddled with their team's conversations. Urgent, low, but intense strategies shifting again in real time. "This complicates things," one voice whispered from Kirk's side. "Or clarifies them," came a response from Jasmine's side. The divide was clearer than ever when proceedings resumed. The tone had shifted once more, heavier, more serious, like everyone understood that the case had just crossed into deeper territory. The questioning continued, but now every answer carried more weight, every reaction more meaning. The stakes had risen, and neither side could afford to misstep. Kirk finally spoke again, his voice controlled, but strained. "This is not being presented fairly." Jasmine turned slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Then, tell it fairly." That exchange was brief but powerful because it highlighted the core of everything: conflicting truths, different perspectives, and a situation that refused to fit into a simple narrative. As the session moved toward another pause, the judge looked over both parties carefully. "This court will reconvene after reviewing all submitted materials." But even that announcement didn't bring relief, because now the waiting began, and waiting in situations like this only makes everything feel more intense. As people started to stand, whispers returned, louder, more chaotic than before, speculation running wild. "What's in that document? Who's telling the truth? Is there more we haven't seen? And the most unsettling question of all, what happens if neither side is completely right or completely wrong?" As Jasmine gathered her things, she hesitated for just a moment, her eyes flickering toward Kirk, who remained seated, staring straight ahead. For a split second, it looked like she might say something, but she didn't. She turned and walked away, and Kirk didn't stop her. That silence between them now felt different, not just tense, but final, in a way that suggested whatever existed between them before was completely broken beyond repair. And as the courtroom slowly emptied, one thing became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a story unraveling in real time, with no clear ending in sight, and every new piece only making it more complicated than the last. The courtroom reconvened, but the atmosphere felt permanently altered, like something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The moment everyone returned to their seats, there was no longer the same noise, the same chaos. Instead, there was a strange, heavy quiet, as if even the audience understood they were watching something reach a breaking point. Jasmine sat with her hands folded, now calmer on the surface, but her eyes gave away that she was processing everything that had just happened: the witness testimony, the document, the shifting balance of belief. Kirk Frost, on the opposite side, looked more controlled again, but it was not the same confidence from day one. It was tighter, forced, like someone holding a door shut against a strong wind. The judge adjusted the papers in front of them, then spoke firmly. "We will now continue examination of the submitted materials and allow both parties to respond." That sentence alone changed the energy again, because now it was no longer just testimony, it was about evidence. What could be proven, what could be challenged, and what could collapse under scrutiny? Kirk's lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor, we maintain that the document introduced earlier lacks proper authentication and may not reflect full context." Jasmine's attorney responded without hesitation. "The document is part of a broader pattern of communication and will be supported by additional corroborating material." The word corroborating made Kirk shift in his seat slightly, and fans are shocked because that was the first time his body language gave away real discomfort. "We object to this narrative being built on selective interpretation," Kirk's lawyer continued, but the judge raised a hand. "The court will evaluate weight and relevance." Continue. A silence followed, and then the attorney turned a page slowly. "This section outlines repeated attempts to disengage from communication after clear requests for space were made." Kirk immediately leaned forward. "That's not how it happened." The judge looked directly at him. "Mr. Frost, if you interrupt again, I will remove you from these proceedings." That warning landed hard, and Kirk leaned back slowly. His jaw tight, his restraint visible but strained. Jasmine didn't look at him this time, she just listened because every word now felt like it was building something larger than just argument, it was building a record. Then came another shift. The attorney continued. We also have metadata confirming timestamps of messages, which align with the witness account of escalating interactions. That phrase timestamps changed everything because it introduced structure, something measurable, something harder to dismiss. Kirk's lawyer quickly responded, timestamps do not interpret intent, no judge. Attorney replied, but they establish sequence, and sequence matters. And that was the point where the courtroom split again, not physically but emotionally, people shifting in their seats, unsure which direction the truth was leaning. Outside the courthouse, the story had already exploded further. Fans are shocked as new leaks from inside began circulating online within minutes. Though no one knew exactly how information was getting out, speculation turned into theories, theories turned into arguments, and the case had now become bigger than the room it was happening in. Back inside, Kirk rubbed his forehead briefly, whispering to his lawyer, "This is getting out of control, stay focused." His lawyer replied quietly, "We respond, not react." But reacting was exactly what everyone was struggling to avoid. Jasmine's attorney then turned slightly toward the witness again, who was still present on standby. Based on what you observed, do these communications reflect what you described earlier? The witness hesitated again, and that hesitation was becoming a pattern that everyone noticed. They reflect part of it, the witness said carefully, part of it. Kirk repeated under his breath, shaking his head, and the attorney followed immediately. What do you mean by part? The witness looked down for a moment. Because communication wasn't always negative. There were moments that were normal, even friendly, but the shifts were sudden and sometimes difficult to understand. That answer created confusion again because it refused to fully support either side completely. Fans are shocked because every time certainty seems close, it dissolves again into complexity. Kirk's lawyer seized on that immediately. So you are admitting there is ambiguity, yes? The witness replied, an ambiguity is not proof of harassment. It can still exist within it. Jasmine's attorney cut in sharply. The tension snapped again, like a rubber band pulled too far. Jasmine finally spoke quietly but clearly. I didn't want ambiguity, I wanted distance. That line landed harder than expected because it wasn't legal language, it was personal. It cut through everything else. For a moment, the room went still again. Then came the most unexpected moment, yet Kirk requested to speak directly. The judge hesitated, then allowed it briefly. He stood slowly adjusting his jacket, his voice controlled but carrying strain. I need to say something because this is not the full story being shown here. All eyes turned toward him, even Jasmine looked up now, fully attentive. Yes, we had disagreements, yes, things got emotional, but this idea that I ignored every boundary, that's not accurate. He paused, looking briefly at the witness, then back forward. There were times she engaged too. There were times she didn't ask for distance, she asked for clarity, for explanations, for closure. Murmurs spread immediately because this was the first time he had laid out his version. This directly. Jasmine's expression tightened slightly. But she did not interrupt. Kirk continued. And if you only take parts of conversations without the full context, you can make anything look one-sided. That statement hung heavy because it introduced doubt again. The same cycle returning, but now stronger. The judge leaned forward slightly. Your statement is noted, Mr. Frost. Then Jasmine's attorney stood again. Your Honor, we are not discussing interpretation, we are discussing behavior patterns over time. Kirk immediately responded, patterns can be misread. And just like that, the courtroom became a clash of narratives again, not just facts, but meaning. The witness looked increasingly uncomfortable, now caught between two versions of reality. Then came another twist no one expected. The judge announced a temporary review of additional submitted evidence from both parties, including communications not yet publicly discussed, and that phrase, not yet publicly discussed, sent a ripple through the entire room. Fans are shocked because it implied there was even more still hidden. Kirk looked down briefly, exhaling slowly as if trying to prepare for something he had not fully anticipated. Jasmine, on the other hand, remained still, but her fingers tightened slightly again, suggesting she knew what might be coming next. Outside the courthouse, chaos intensified. Reporters shouting over each other, trying to confirm rumors of additional evidence leaks, unidentified sources claiming more messages, more recordings, more context that could completely shift the case again. Inside the courtroom, the judge called for another recess to review everything properly, and that was when the most intense silence of the day fell. No arguments, no interruptions, just anticipation as people began to move again. Kirk remained seated for a moment longer, staring forward like he was stuck in thought. Then he finally stood for the first time since this began. He walked a few steps, not toward exit, not toward Jasmine, but just forward into empty space. Like he needed distance from everything, Jasmine also stood but stayed where she was, watching him carefully, and, for a brief moment, their eyes met again. No shouting, no accusations. Just exhaustion and something unresolved beneath it. Then Kirk turned away first, and that small action somehow felt bigger than all the arguments combined, because it suggested not resolution, not victory, but separation of something deeper than the case itself. As the room slowly emptied again, one thing became undeniable: the truth was still not fully on the table, and whatever came next after the recess could either clarify everything or destroy the last remaining certainty. Anyone had left the courtroom doors reopened after the recess. But nothing about the atmosphere felt reset. If anything, it felt heavier, like the pause had allowed tension to settle deeper into every corner of the room. People returned, slowly, conversations cutting off mid-sentence as soon as the judge entered the bench and called the session back to order. Jasmine was already seated, her posture straighter than before, but her expression now carried a quiet intensity, like she had prepared herself for something final. Kirk Frost sat opposite her again, but his stillness was different. Now less reactive, more guarded, like he was bracing for impact rather than fighting back. The judge looked over the files in front of them. After review of the additional submitted materials, this court will now address supplemental evidence and witness clarification. That single line shifted everything again, because it meant the evidence wasn't finished, there was more, and everyone in the room could feel it. Kirk leaned slightly toward his lawyer, whispering, "What else did they submit?" His lawyer didn't answer immediately, which in itself was an answer. Jasmine's attorney stood calmly. "Your Honor, we would like to proceed with contextual audio material that supports prior testimony regarding communication patterns and emotional escalation." A wave of reaction moved through the courtroom instantly. Fans are shocked because audio meant something different entirely. It was no longer interpretation or memory, it was voices, tone, emotion, something harder to deny. Kirk's head lifted. Immediately. Audio? What audio? The judge raised a hand. "You will have opportunity to respond, Mr. Frost." But the shift had already happened. Attention locked forward. Everyone waiting. The recording was introduced and played. It wasn't loud at first, just voices, low, slightly unclear at the edges, but recognizable enough for the room to react immediately. Jasmine's voice first, calm, then tense, followed by Kirk's voice responding, faster, sharper, more defensive than he appeared in court. Words overlapped, moments of silence, interruptions. Frustration building in real time, and as it played, the energy in the room changed completely. What had been argument now sounded like memory replayed, raw, unfiltered. Kirk shook his head almost immediately. This is taken out of context. But his voice lacked force now, because hearing it made it harder to control perception. Jasmine didn't look at him, she just listened, her face tightening slightly as if reliving it rather than watching it. The recording continued. There were mentions of space requests, repeated explanations, emotional exhaustion, and responses that escalated instead of de-escalating, and each line added weight to the claims already on the table. But then something unexpected appeared in the audio. A shift in tone on both sides, a moment where conversation briefly softened, where the tension reduced, even if only 4 seconds, and that moment complicated everything again. Fans are shocked, because nothing was clean, nothing was absolute. When the audio stopped, the courtroom stayed silent for a few seconds. Too long. The judge finally spoke. "Both parties will address the context of this material." Kirk's lawyer immediately stood. "Your Honor, this recording does not reflect the full timeline. It isolates moments without surrounding exchanges." Jasmine's attorney responded, "It reflects escalation, which is the central issue, not isolated harmony." That word escalation became the focus again, because it framed everything differently, not as single incidents but progression. Kirk finally spoke again, his voice controlled but strained. "You're building a narrative from fragments, that's what this is." Jasmine turned slightly this time, her voice steady. "No, we're showing what it felt like over time." That contrast hit the room harder than expected, because it wasn't about facts alone anymore, it was about experience, perception, reality from two completely different perspectives. The witness was called again for clarification. They stepped forward, looking more uncomfortable than before, now fully aware that every word was shaping public judgment beyond the courtroom. "Do you recognize the voices in the recording?" Jasmine's attorney asked. "Yes." The witness replied. "Does this align with what you previously described?" A pause again. "Yes, it does, but it also shows moments where tone changed from both sides." That answer again refused to fully support either narrative. Kirk's lawyer quickly followed. "So you agree communication was mutual in escalation?" "In parts, yes," the witness admitted, and that phrase, "in parts," became another fracture point. Jasmine's attorney leaned in. But did you observe repeated patterns of one party requesting distance? Yes. And did those requests appear to be respected consistently? Another pause, longer this time. Not consistently. That landed heavily. Kirk exhaled sharply, looking down for a moment, rubbing his hand across his face, clearly struggling with the direction things were moving. Fans are shocked because the case was no longer leaning cleanly toward either side. It was becoming layered, contradictory, and emotionally complex. Then came another unexpected moment. Kirk asked to submit additional clarification himself. Again the judge allowed it with caution. He stood slowly. I'm not denying that emotions were high. I'm not denying arguments happened. What I'm saying is this is being framed like one person had full control over every situation, and that's not accurate. He looked briefly toward Jasmine, then back forward. There were times I felt confused about where things stood. There were mixed signals. There were conversations that didn't clearly end or clearly continue, and that matters too. That statement shifted the energy again because it introduced uncertainty into intent. Jasmine finally responded quietly. Confusion is not the same as disregard for boundaries. Kirk looked at her now fully, and boundaries aren't always clearly communicated in real time. When people are in conflict, that exchange hit differently because it wasn't anger anymore, it was exhaustion layered with unresolved emotion. The judge leaned forward again. This court is not determining emotional intent alone, it is assessing documented behavior. But even that clarification didn't settle anything because behavior itself was now interpreted differently by both sides. The attorney for Jasmine requested one final submission for the day, a timeline reconstruction mapping communication events against witness observations, and submitted evidence. Kirk's lawyer immediately objected. This is a constructed interpretation, not independent verification. It is a synthesis of verified materials, came the response. The judge accepted it for review, and that decision alone signaled that things were still unfolding, not concluding. As documents were handed in, the courtroom atmosphere shifted into something quieter, more reflective, like everyone was realizing this was not ending soon. Outside the courthouse, the story had reached another level entirely. Fans are shocked as clips, audio fragments, and alleged summaries circulated online, turning the case into a public storm of interpretation where everyone believed they understood what was happening, but no one truly had the full picture inside. Kirk sat back again, this time not speaking, not reacting, just staring forward, as if trying to piece together where everything had gone off track. Jasmine remained composed, but her eyes occasionally shifted downward, suggesting the emotional weight was still there beneath her controlled exterior. The judge finally spoke. We will adjourn, pending full review of all submitted materials. And just like that, another pause, another suspension of resolution. But this time, there was no relief because everyone understood. The review would not simplify things, it would likely reveal even more complexity as people began to stand again. There was no rush, no noise, just slow movement, like the room itself was processing what had been revealed. Kirk and Jasmine both stood at nearly the same time, but neither moved immediately. For a moment they were just across from each other again. No lawyers speaking, no witnesses, no judge, just two people in a space filled with everything that had been said and everything that still hadn't been fully understood. Kirk looked at her briefly, then away. Jasmine held her position for a second longer, then turned slightly, and without another word they both walked away in opposite directions, and that separation felt final in a way the court documents never could define, because whatever happened next, it was no longer just about evidence or testimony, it was about two versions of reality that might never fully align. The next morning the courtroom was already surrounded before sunrise, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. The case between Jasmine Washington and Kirk Frost had now grown beyond a legal dispute and become a public obsession. Every entrance, every movement, every expression was being watched and analyzed as cameras lined the steps and reporters shouted over each other, trying to get the first reaction of the day inside the building. The atmosphere was even more intense than before because everyone knew the final phase of evidence review was about to begin. Jasmine entered first again, but this time there was something different in her posture, less uncertainty, more resolve, like she had already accepted whatever outcome might come from this point forward. Kirk Frost arrived shortly after, his expression guarded but visibly tense, his usual composure replaced by a quieter, more calculated demeanor, like someone preparing for impact rather than conversation. The judge entered and immediately called the room to order, signaling that this session would focus on final consolidated review of all materials submitted by both sides, which included witness testimony, recorded communication timelines, and corroborating statements from both parties. Legal teams. The first presentation came from Jasmine's attorney, who laid out a structured timeline of events showing repeated communication patterns, escalation points, and documented requests for space that were allegedly not respected consistently. Kirk's legal team immediately challenged the framing, arguing that the timeline was selective and lacked full conversational context, presenting instead alternative excerpts meant to show mutual interaction and emotional reciprocity between both parties. The courtroom became sharply divided as each side attempted to redefine the same events through different interpretations. Fans are shocked because what was once thought to be straightforward has now become a deeply layered contradiction where every piece of evidence seems to carry to possible meanings. Jasmine remained mostly still as the timeline was read aloud, occasionally tightening her grip on the edge of the table, while Kirk leaned back and forward, intermittently, clearly reacting internally, but trying to maintain restraint. When the witness was called again for final clarification, they appeared noticeably more stressed, aware that their words were now central to both legal interpretation and public perception. Under questioning, they confirmed that while interactions between Jasmine and Kirk did include moments of mutual engagement, there were also repeated instances where boundaries were communicated but not always consistently acknowledged or respected fully, which immediately reignited debate in the courtroom. Kirk's lawyer seized on the ambiguity, emphasizing that acknowledgement of mutual interaction undermined claims of one-sided harassment, while Jasmine's attorney countered that acknowledgement of interaction does not erase repeated disregard of expressed discomfort. The judge repeatedly intervened to maintain order as voices briefly rose, showing just how emotionally charged the environment had become outside the courthouse. The situation had escalated even further, with fans and media outlets dissecting every leaked detail, every alleged quote, and every fragment of testimony, attempting to piece together a coherent narrative from incomplete information. Inside, Kirk finally spoke more openly than he had in previous sessions, stating that the situation had evolved into something where private misunderstandings were now being interpreted as legal wrongdoing, and insisting that emotional complexity was being flattened into accusation. Jasmine responded calmly but firmly, stating that emotional complexity does not excuse patterns of behavior that cause distress over time, and that the central issue remained repeated disregard of communicated boundaries. The judge listened carefully before announcing that all materials would be taken under final advisement and that a decision or further directive would follow after comprehensive review of submitted evidence, but made clear that no immediate ruling would be issued that day. A wave of frustration and exhaustion moved through the courtroom as both sides realized there would be no closure yet, only continuation of uncertainty. Kirk and Jasmine sat in silence for several moments, not speaking, not looking directly at each other, as the reality of prolonged legal scrutiny settled in around them. The witness was excused and left the stand visibly relieved, as if finally stepping out of a storm that had grown beyond their control. Legal teams gathered their files, preparing for further submissions if required, while murmurs spread again through the audience, speculating about what evidence might still exist that had not yet been revealed. Fans are shocked because the case no longer feels like it belongs to just two people, but to an entire narrative that keeps expanding beyond control. As the session adjourned, both Jasmine and Kirk rose slowly, neither in haste, neither in confrontation, but in a quiet exhaustion that suggested emotional depletion more than victory or defeat. And as they moved toward opposite exits for the final time that day, the distance between them felt permanent, not just physically but in everything that had unfolded between them over the course of the proceedings, leaving behind a lingering question that no document, no testimony, and no recording had fully answered, about where truth truly ends and perception begins. The final hearing of the week opened under a heavier silence than ever before, as if everyone inside the courtroom understood that whatever happened today would not just add another layer to the case, but potentially define its direction moving forward. The public frenzy outside had reached a breaking point, with crowds gathering earlier than usual, and media outlets broadcasting live commentary before proceedings even began. Inside, Jasmine Washington appeared composed but noticeably more distant, her expression less reactive now, almost detached, as though she had moved beyond emotional engagement into pure endurance. Kirk Frost arrived shortly after his legal team. Close beside him, his face controlled but carrying a fatigue that had not been visible in earlier sessions. The judge entered and immediately acknowledged that the court would now address final rebuttals before closing the evidentiary phase, which meant both sides would have one last opportunity to challenge interpretations of the materials already submitted. Jasmine's attorney began by summarizing the established Timeline again emphasizing repeated communication patterns. Documented requests for space and corroboration from witness testimony, while Kirk's legal team responded by reinforcing their position that context had been selectively presented and that emotional exchanges had been reframed as unilateral escalation. Fans are shocked because despite days of testimony, the courtroom still felt split down the middle with no definitive clarity emerging from either side. Kirk leaned forward as his attorney spoke, occasionally shaking his head slightly but not interrupting, while Jasmine remained still, her focus forward. Her hands folded tightly in front of her. When given the opportunity to respond, Kirk stood slowly, choosing his words, carefully stating that the narrative being built around him failed to reflect the complexity of real human relationships, where miscommunication, confusion, and emotional volatility often coexist without malicious intent. He emphasized that he never intentionally disregarded boundaries but acknowledged that interpretations of communication can differ depending on perspective and emotional state. Jasmine then responded without hesitation, stating that regardless of intention, the impact of repeated interactions, after clear expressions of discomfort, created a pattern that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding alone. Her tone remained steady but firm, drawing a visible shift in the room as the weight of impact versus intent became the central divide in the argument. The judge intervened multiple times to maintain structure as both legal teams attempted to reinforce their positions through selective emphasis of evidence, while the witness was briefly recalled once more to clarify discrepancies in prior statements. They reiterated that while interactions between both parties contained mutual elements, there were also consistent indications of emotional strain and repeated requests for distance that were not always followed by immediate behavioral adjustment. This testimony again failed to fully satisfy either side, but reinforced the complexity of the situation rather than resolving it outside the courthouse. The narrative had exploded into multiple competing interpretations, with some framing Jasmine as courageous for speaking out, and others viewing Kirk as misunderstood and unfairly portrayed. Fans are shocked because every new detail seemed to both confirm and contradict previous assumptions, making certainty impossible. Inside, Kirk appeared increasingly restrained as the session progressed, occasionally glancing down or toward his legal team, while Jasmine maintained a steady composure that suggested emotional withdrawal rather than engagement. The court then reviewed a final consolidated exhibit, combining communication logs, witness notes, and timeline reconstruction, which visually demonstrated overlapping interactions, moments of escalation, and periods of neutrality that complicated any simple linear interpretation. Kirk's attorney immediately challenged the exhibit as interpretive rather than evidentiary, while Jasmine's attorney argued that patterns emerging across multiple sources could not be dismissed as coincidence or misrepresentation. The judge listened without interruption before stating that all submissions would be taken into final consideration and that no further evidence would be accepted at this stage. Effectively closing the evidentiary phase of the case, a noticeable shift occurred in the room as realization set in that no more new information would be introduced, leaving only interpretation and judgment remaining. The tension softened slightly, not because conflict had resolved but because escalation had reached its procedural limit. Kirk sat back, slowly exhaling, while Jasmine looked down briefly before returning her gaze forward, neither speaking, neither acknowledging the other directly, as silence filled the space between them more heavily than any argument that had preceded it. When the court was temporarily adjourned, both legal teams gathered their materials in quiet discussion, while spectators began to leave, murmuring about how unresolved everything still felt. Fans are shocked because despite everything that had been presented, there was still no clear winner, no definitive conclusion, only competing narratives suspended in uncertainty. As Kirk and Jasmine eventually rose to leave, they did so without confrontation, without dialogue, moving in opposite directions through the same doorway that now symbolized not resolution but separation, leaving behind a case that had transformed from a legal dispute into a lasting question about perception, truth, and the fragile space between what is said and what is understood. The courtroom reconvened one final time under an atmosphere so heavy it almost felt unreal, as though the building itself understood that it was about to witness the closing arguments of a case that had already escaped the boundaries of a simple legal dispute and turned into a public psychological battlefield where every word carried consequences far beyond the room. Jasmine Washington entered with a controlled stillness that no longer looked like nervous restraint but rather emotional exhaustion shaped into discipline. Kirk Frost followed shortly after, maintaining a composed exterior but with eyes that betrayed fatigue and pressure that had been building for days. The judge entered, and formally announced that both parties would now present their final statements before the court. Moved into deliberation and potential ruling consideration, which immediately shifted the entire room into complete silence because everyone understood that what came next would be the last structured opportunity to shape interpretation of everything that had been presented over the course of the proceedings. Jasmine's attorney stood first, summarizing once again the established narrative, emphasizing repeated communication patterns, witness corroboration, documented expressions of discomfort, and the constructed timeline, showing escalation over time while deliberately framing the case around behavioral impact rather than emotional interpretation. Kirk's legal team responded immediately, reinforcing that context must be considered in full, that interactions were mutual, that emotional exchanges were misrepresented through selective framing, and that intent could not be ignored when evaluating alleged misconduct. Fans are shocked because even at the final stage, the courtroom still felt split in half with no unified version of truth emerging, both sides deeply entrenched in fundamentally different interpretations of the same events. Kirk then rose for his final statement, speaking with measured control, stating that the proven situation had evolved into something far removed from its origin, that private communication, misunderstandings, and emotional volatility had been transformed into a legal narrative that failed to reflect shared complexity. He insisted that he never engaged with harmful intent and emphasized that perception without full context could distort reality in ways that permanently damage reputations and relationships. Jasmine followed with her own final statement, maintaining calm but firm tone as she stated that regardless of emotional complexity or mutual interaction, the consistent factor remained repeated disregard of expressed boundaries, and that the core issue was not interpretation of feelings but impact of actions over time. She made it clear that speaking out was not about rewriting history but about acknowledging patterns that had caused harm, and that silence had no longer been an option once those patterns persisted. The judge listened carefully without interruption as both sides concluded their remarks, occasionally glancing at notes before acknowledging that all arguments had been heard and that the court would now proceed into final consideration phase. The atmosphere shifted again into something quieter, almost suspended, as legal teams began organizing documents and preparing for what would follow outside the courthouse. The situation had reached peak intensity, with media coverage framing the moment as potentially decisive, while online communities erupted into debate, analyzing every statement, every expression, and every perceived inconsistency. Fans are shocked because despite the emotional weight and volume of evidence presented over multiple sessions, there remained no universally accepted version of truth, only competing narratives that continued to fracture public opinion into opposing camps. Inside the courtroom, silence lingered after statements ended, with neither Jasmine nor Kirk speaking to each other directly, both remaining seated for a moment longer than necessary, as if acknowledging subconsciously that whatever connection or conflict existed between them had now fully transitioned into institutional judgment rather than personal confrontation. The judge finally announced that the court would recess pending final deliberation and that a ruling date or further directive would be communicated after review of all submitted materials. This announcement did not bring relief, instead it deepened uncertainty. Because there was no immediate resolution, only waiting, and waiting now carried the weight of inevitability rather than anticipation. As people began to stand and gather their belongings, Kirk looked briefly toward Jasmine but did not speak while she remained still, not returning the glance but clearly aware of it. The witness exited, quietly escorted by court staff. While attorneys engaged in subdued discussion about procedural next steps, the room slowly emptied, leaving behind echoes of arguments that had stretched across days but never fully converged into closure. As Kirk eventually stood and walked toward the exit with a controlled but distant posture, and Jasmine followed moments later, moving in the opposite direction without pause or acknowledgement, and as both disappeared through separate exits, the case that had consumed public attention reached its most defining moment, not in verdict or resolution but in suspended uncertainty, where truth remained divided, perception remained contested, and the final answer still had not been spoken, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any conclusion could have provided. And just like that, the courtroom doors close on a case that has left everyone asking the same question: what is the truth, and who is really telling it? Because after days of testimony, conflicting statements, emotional breakdowns, witness accounts, and explosive evidence, the situation between Jasmine Washington and Kirk Frost has only become more complicated, not less. Fans are shocked because instead of clarity, we are left with tension, silence, and two completely different versions of reality that still refuse to align. Jasmine walks away with a sense of having finally spoken, her truth out loud while Kirk leaves under the weight of accusations. He continues to deny but cannot fully escape the perception surrounding them, and the most unsettling part is that the court has not delivered a final public ruling yet, meaning everything is still hanging in uncertainty. Waiting for that one decision that could shift public opinion all over again, emotions ran high. Throughout the entire process, the family was left divided. Supporters on both sides continue arguing online, and every new leaked detail only adds more fuel to an already uncontrollable fire. But now the question becomes, what happens next? Will new evidence surface? Will the court side with Jasmine's claims, or will Kirk manage to clear his name in the final ruling, or is there still something deeper that has not even come out yet, something that could completely change everything we thought we understood about this case and the people involved? And that is exactly why this story is far from over, because when emotions are this high and contradictions are this strong, silence never lasts for long. So what do you think? Is Jasmine telling the full truth, or is there another side we still haven't seen? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this case is still unfolding and every opinion matters. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because as soon as the next update drops, you will want to be the first to know.